This is a video response to option 1 for the assignment in the Inclusive Education module, module code ET7923. The information in this video is largely drawn from the Inclusion Dialogue book by Joanne Banks. References to specific chapters will be noted as the information is discussed throughout the video. To start, we must first define what is inclusive education. The CRPD defines it as access to and progress in high-quality formal and informal education without discrimination. UNICEF more simply says that it means all children in the same classrooms in the same schools. Inclusive quality education is also one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals adopted by world leaders to tackle major global inequalities by 2030. To understand and discuss inclusive education today, we must first know its history. Kate de Bruin provides this in Chapter 3 of the Inclusion Dialogue book. The first place in history we see mention of inclusion is in the 1920s, where it begins a segregation of the defective or dull from the normal. This is followed in the 1930s by the rise of the eugenics movement, where children with disabilities were beginning to be seen as a threat and therefore segregated further. After the horrific genocide towards people with disabilities during World War II, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created within the UN to affirm the equal and inalienable rights of all individuals as the basis for freedom, justice and peace during this time. In the 1970s, Article 23 of the CRC outlined a lower educational standard for children with disabilities, defined as special care relative to their condition, with the aim of fullest possible social integration within the limitations imposed by their condition. In 2006, the CRPD applies established human rights principles to people with disabilities. In 2016, the UN CRPD Article 24, Comment 4 makes clear that the placement of students with disabilities into special schools or special units and classrooms within mainstream schools constitutes segregation, and that these measures are incompatible with inclusion. There are also some specific Irish policies around inclusive education. The Education Act in 1998 guarantees a constitutional right to appropriate education for all children. The EPSN Act 2004 builds on this by mandating that all children with SEN needs are to be educated in an inclusive setting. However, 20 years after it was initially passed, the EPSN Act has yet to be fully commenced. Inclusion Ireland highlighted the need to review parts of the Act that are contrary to the UN CRPD, in particular Section 2 of the Act that currently allows for exceptions to inclusive education be made if not in the best interests of both the child with special educational needs and the other children with whom the child is expected to be educated. A review of the EPSN Act was carried out by the government in 2022, which confirmed that important parts of the Act were not put into place, for example IEPs. We can see that policy dictates fully inclusive education, but how is this put into practice? Fovet discusses UDL in Chapter 6 of the Inclusion Dialogue book. Universal Design for Learning moves away from the medical model of disabilities and translates into practice the social model of disability instead. This social model suggests that disability is a construct, a lack of fit between individual embodiments and the design of environments, products or experiences, rather than any inherent characteristic of the individual. UDL is the only model within inclusive practices which shifts the focus away from the expectations of the learner and focuses its attention on the role of the teacher as designer of the learning experience. It does this within a whole class approach, where learner diversity is seen as a given and multiple pathways are designed into all aspects of the learning experience. UDL so far is mostly used to advocate for greater flexibility in instruction and assessment. The hope is that UDL will provide equitable access to learning to students who may have otherwise been left out. To discuss the model of inclusive education in practice internationally, I will primarily discuss two chapters in the Inclusion Dialogue book, written by Dr. Heidrun de Mol, Associate Professor for Inclusive Education and Director of the Competence Centre for School Inclusion at the Free University of Bolzano in Italy. Heidrun discusses her work on the historical factors that shaped the Italian education system, which operates a full inclusion model where all children are educated together, and Professor Bram Norwich, Professor of Educational Psychology and Special Educational Needs at the Graduate School of Education at the University of Exeter, who examines the developments of inclusive education in the United Kingdom and his view on full inclusion. Chapter 4, Heidrun discusses Italy's journey to a fully inclusive system, which started in 1962, when tracking was limited to upper secondary schools, so every child attended their local school for the first 8 years of education. In the 1970s, schools began to accept students with disabilities, pushed by the 1968 protest movements in Italy, where the Catholics and the political left fought against the dominant powers and their ideologies. Psychiatry faced a strong deinstitutionalization trend that led to the closure of asylums, which caused the introduction of inclusive structures. The period following this radical change was known as a period of wild integration, described by Demoe as a time when many teachers were deeply committed to the value of inclusion. She states in her chapter, "Nobody really knew how to deal with it. This translated into a very welcoming atmosphere, but in practice also into lots of challenges that needed to be faced day by day. It was a time of great creativity." This translated to a change from within model inspired by Freinet, organised joint learning groups of teachers that developed, reflected on and shared practices for inclusive and democratic schooling. No formal studies have been conducted on the effects of this fully inclusive system. However, anecdotal evidence shows that school careers tended to extend with a higher quality of workplace satisfaction, confidence in the future, and perceived normality in social life. Although fully inclusive, there are claimable rights or special measures for some students that belong to SEN categories. An example of these are individual education plans, carefully designed what and how particular students would learn for a school year, and specialised additional personal resources assigned to the class attended by that student. Heidrun goes on in her chapter to discuss the consequences she believes arise due to ambivalent legislation and frameworks in place. These appendices of mainstream learning and teaching can include the use of IEPs as an exclusionary instrument that creates a sort of segregated learning path for specific students, or the allocation of teaching assistants to specific children with SEN or disability needs, when these TAs are formally meant to be assigned to a class and are fully responsible for the whole of them. However, Heidrun provides ideas for ways out of these consequences. Heidrun nominates teachers as the solution to the problems in the current Italian education system. She believes there doesn't need to be a choice between treating all students the same way in the same learning spaces with common provisions and identifying some specific students to provide necessary support measures for. A possible way out instead can be found in the balance between the two. Teachers can achieve this by committing to creating both opportunities for differentiation that look at specific individuals' needs, as well as opportunities for being part of the group, and by working together as professionals to reflect and improve on their practice. Chapter 9, Norwich discusses the UK school system, which operates as an integrated system similar to what is currently being seen in practice in Ireland. The system is supported by the Wernick Report released in 1978, which adopts the use of the SEN framework. SEN is based on individual assessment, emphasising a learner-centred, anti-deficit and continuum of needs approach. However, the legislation supporting this report was weak in its application in schools to accommodate students with SEN, where individual assessments and statements of need were intended to be learner-centred, often led to bureaucratic segregation instead. Norwich agrees with Heidrun's idea of a balancing act between the systems, for flexible arrangements allowing differentiated support without stigmatisation, and sees inclusion as a forever ongoing process of balancing these tensions. From a practical standpoint, he can see that more inclusive systems can be more cost efficient, and with research that shows that learning outcomes are not worse, these financial pressures could raise questions about the choice of the UK government to not explore a system similar to Italy's. His proposed solution is one of moderate inclusion, allowing for flexibility and context as a compromise between the two systems, and he warns that full inclusion can become a moral ideology, which often means that special schools and classes are abandoned and the needs of students can be neglected. The authors agree that the topic of inclusive education in practice is extremely complicated, and neither full inclusion or segregation is the right answer. An ongoing balancing act is the reality in classrooms, guided by a teacher with best intentions for each individual learner, considering context and individual needs.